for Dr. Quinlan.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pooja, and on behalf of the Parents Association, I'd like to welcome you to a special presentation given by Dr. Richard, a true dynamo.
As long as you guys are okay with that. Okay.
I emailed it to you.
How are you doing?
Sorry. Chelsea, are we good? Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry. So I'd like to welcome you to a special presentation given by Dr. Richard Quinlan, a true dynamo who has taught at the Greenville School for over 25 years, earning 3 master's degrees as well as a PhD in Holocaust and Genocide Studies this past summer. Please enjoy being in class with Dr. Quinlan as he discusses the plight of Afghanistan in a way that ties in with his coveted global studies.
I'm going to do it. I got it all here. Okay, I'll take care of it.
And with that, I will hand it over to Richard.
Thank you so much, Pooja. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here tonight. Thank you to you and Ari. Both of you have been extraordinarily supportive and incredibly loud voices in making this happen this evening. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. And thank you for that intro. I'm glad my mother's email reached you safely and you were able to share what she wrote. It was very nice. She's not a bad writer. So thank you very much for that. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, what we are going to do is take a look at a country that right now has dominated the news for really the past couple of months. But sadly, if you have been watching the past 10 days to 2 weeks, it's begun to fade from the lead stories. And that is, of course, Afghanistan. And before I dive into what tonight is going to be, I want to make it clear what tonight is not. Tonight is not about the 20-year war in Afghanistan fought by the United States. It is not about the evacuation. What this really is going to be about where Afghanistan goes from where it is right now. A country that is back under the control of the Taliban, a group that we had not seen truly in power in 20 years, and a country whose future is terribly unsettled and unfortunately seems to be on a very, very difficult path to fully grasp, and one that may lead it down a horrific path of violence. And what I would like to do is sort of just give a quick overview of some Afghan history, get into more contemporary events with our key point being tonight, the Soviet invasion in 1979. Talk today a little bit more about the terror organizations that are now unfortunately finding safe haven in Afghanistan. And then finally take a look at some of Afghanistan's relationships with the other major players in its region, specifically Pakistan, China, Iran, Russia, and India. Now, that being said, and I promise this will be the only slide with a lot of words, as a very, very, very brief snippet of Afghan history, because this is a country whose history is thousands of years old. But just looking at the 20th century, Afghanistan broke away from England in 1921, becoming an independent nation after the Third British-Afghan War. By 1929, the monarchy that had been quite shaky for 8 years was gone. And beginning in 1933, the new king was a man named Shah. Now, during Shah's time in control of Afghanistan, there was relative peace in this country. In fact, 1 year after his ascension to power, the United Nations recognized Afghanistan as a member of that organization. But things begin to change in 1947. In 47, when England departs from India, we saw the partition into India and Pakistan. Now, what that created was a border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and really what we still see today as some of those geopolitical agitations. We could chart all the way back to 1947. Afghanistan's history begins to be shaped in the 1950s in a more significant way as a pawn of the Cold War. Afghanistan has tremendous support from the Soviet Union. And during much of the 50s, 60s, and even into the mid to late 1970s, Afghanistan would strike us as a very different country from what we think of it today. Women worked, they walked the streets, they were allowed to go to school. It was not the repressive type of nation that we now associate with the Taliban. However, in 1973, the relatively stable government of General Mohammed Daoud Khan he leads a rebellion that overthrows the government of Zahir Shah. See, Khan had been the prime minister, and Khan was really the significant player in generating a positive relationship with the Soviets. Khan takes over in 73, Shah is driven out, and what Khan says is he's going to take this communist country of Afghanistan and he's going to modernize it. He's going to really kind of drag it into the late 20th century. Now, this is done while the Soviets are still very much in support of this. However, within 5 years, Khan is murdered, and he's killed by communist opponents who are actually fearful of his modernization ideas. When he is killed, what you end up seeing is a movement within Afghanistan that is far more conservative. The new government claims, under the leadership of Mohammad Taraki, they say we are now going to be an Islamic republic. We are no longer going to associate ourselves with the Soviet Union, with communism. We are pulling back from being a player in the Cold War. We are going to be an Islamic republic, which, as you can imagine, absolutely infuriates and somewhat terrifies the Soviet Union, a country that at that point is struggling horrifically economically, although most of the world is still there. Within a year of Khan's death, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. That 1979 Soviet invasion is one of the tipping points in Afghan history. The world is shocked. Most world leaders said they didn't see this coming. They didn't fully understand. Well, the reason why the Soviets went into Afghanistan is they are trying to save the fragments of this communist state, and they are absolutely terrified that what happened in Iran with the Islamic Revolution in Iran will spread to Afghanistan. So the Soviets go in 79. Among the critical players that we were talking about, you see Zahir Shah spending time with President Kennedy. There is Mohammed Daoud Khan in his sort of official military portrait. And then was Nikita Khrushchev, who was a remarkably vocal supporter of communist Afghanistan. That's actually a picture of Khrushchev visiting a bakery in Kabul, a bakery that was built by the Soviet Union and their money. And as you can see, he seems fascinated by that piece of pastry that's shaped like a hen. Khrushchev actually got himself in trouble with the leaders of the Soviet Union because they considered him to appear too friendly, and he liked to smile too much on camera. And this is one such image of Khrushchev actually looking like he's enjoying himself, which the Soviets frowned upon. Now, when this war begins, I think that cartoon really does a brilliant job summing up what's happening. You have the leaders of the United States, Germany, and France demanding that the Soviets leave. And the Soviet leader at the time, Leonid Brezhnev, as you can see, is well entrenched in Afghanistan. The Soviets were not going anywhere. Sometimes the Afghan-Soviet war is referred to as the Soviet Vietnam. And one of the reasons why is because not only does it drain the Soviet Union of massive amounts of money, and you have many, many young soldiers who don't fully understand why they're there, but it was also in their military techniques. The Soviets believed that they could use heavy equipment, planes, tanks, their latest bombs, and they would simply beat the Afghan people into submission. It didn't work. The Afghans were fighting for something far greater than any leader or any political system. The Mujahideen were the warriors of God. They saw their reasoning for defending their country against the Soviets as being a mandate from heaven. And so their fighting was absolutely ruthless against the Soviet Union, pure guerrilla warfare, something that the Soviets had not really been trained to fight. In addition to this, the Mujahideen was also receiving money, weapons, and training from the American CIA. So you look at that picture there, the Mujahideen sitting next to that shot down Soviet helicopter, and you have an indication of what was going wrong in that war for the Soviets. Now, among the members of that Mujahideen that were actually getting trained by the CIA was Osama Bin Laden. At that time, the world did not know his name. Many people knew his last name because the Bin Ladens owned the largest construction company in Saudi Arabia. Essentially, the majority of that country was built by Bin Laden construction. So had Osama Bin Laden chosen, he could have selected a life of incredible leisure, wealth, and comfort. Instead, he believed that he was motivated by faith to travel to Afghanistan, join the Mujahideen, and fight against the communists. Now, obviously, we all understand who Bin Laden is and the horrors that he was responsible for creating. What we sometimes forget is that the origin of Al-Qaeda, the base as it translates, actually originates in the Afghan-Soviet War. Bin Laden's hatred of the Soviet Union is coupled with his hatred of the Western powers, specifically the United States, who, even though they were trying to support the Mujahideen, decided to then leave Afghanistan when the Soviets did. And this left Afghanistan in a state of tremendous political vacuum. There was no one truly in power. The country falls into a dreadful civil war. And Bin Laden and others felt that, well, you see, the West just lies to us again, the way they have going all the way back to the days before World War I. And that's part of, certainly not the full reason, but that's part of where the inspiration for Al-Qaeda first begins to germinate. And if you look now, 10 years after Bin Laden's death, you see on that map the number of groups that in many ways are directly inspired or influenced by his teachings. And what is most frightening about that image is you do not see any green arrows of any of those groups beginning to weaken. Some are maintaining strength, but the majority are either strengthening or rapidly strengthening. And some of these groups that we must begin to become familiar with and begin to educate all of us about include AQIM, which is Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb. That's a group that plans to overthrow the Algerian government. You have AQIS, Al-Qaeda of the Indian subcontinent. Now, their plan is to create a Muslim Islamic caliphate in the countries of Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. They want to overthrow all 5 of those governments and bring all 5 of those nations under the control of one caliphate. You have Al-Shabaab in Africa, a group that stands for the youth. They're fighting in Somalia. They want to make Somalia a caliphate and an Islamic republic. You have Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, a country that has helped to turn Yemen into truly the worst humanitarian crisis that no one is talking about. Yemen has been in a civil war for over 5 years. Nearly 90% of the children in Yemen do not go to school, and nearly 3/4 of the children in Yemen face starvation. One of the critical reasons why that occurs is because of the destabilization of that country caused by AQAP. So, and that's just a small collection of some of the larger groups that we know much about. What is beginning to happen with a number of these organizations throughout Afghanistan and Central Asia, then into Africa, and of course, what we consider the more traditional Middle East, is they are splintering. and they're sort of scurrying like spiders across the region. And it's these small splinter cells that are truly among the more frightening aspects of what's happening. Now, the Taliban is not a new group. It did not emerge in the early 2000s. It first emerged during the end of the Afghan-Soviet War. And if you look there, you see that image of a Mujahideen fighter. And that is a Stinger anti-aircraft missile launcher made by the United States. And it was exactly that type of weapon that was taking down those Soviet helicopters. Incredibly, it was some of those same weapons being used in the war involving America for the past 20 years. Some of those US-made weapons were still in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, in 1989, I apologize, after 10 years of fighting, the Soviets leave in a humiliating manner. The defeat of the Soviet Union by Afghanistan was a shocking result. This was a country truly that most people saw as a collection of small tribal farmers. How in the world did they defeat one of the two great superpowers of the age? Well, the Soviets went about the war incorrectly, and quite frankly, they didn't have any money. The Soviet Union was bankrupt by 1989. The last man to leave, General Boris Gromov, seen there leaving with his son, walked across a bridge that connected Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. That bridge, like so many other bridges and roads in Afghanistan, were built by the Soviets. So the Soviets were retreating on the same roads and bridges that they had once built back when they were giving Afghanistan so much support. So the Taliban is going to emerge out of the chaos of the post-Soviet years. Now, the man you see here, Mohammed Najibullah, was the president of Afghanistan, and he had really been handpicked and sort of groomed by the Soviets. Now, he was placed in power in 1987. The war ends in 89. When the war ends in 89, all of the support, whether it be political or financial, dries up. The Soviet Union is now beginning to crumble. 89, of course, is when the Berlin Wall comes down. It's the idea that democracy is beginning to sweep across Eastern Europe, and all of the strong communist forces are crumbling away. So therefore, the Soviets had no interest in trying to defend somebody who was in Afghanistan. He was no longer on their map. So what ends up occurring is that Najibullah runs for his life, and he's hiding in a UN compound in Kabul, Afghanistan. He lives there for several years. No other country wants him, by the way. He can't get out. In 1996, the Taliban takes control. They find the now former president. They arrest him, torture him, murder him, drag his body through the streets, and ultimately hang it from a street lamp as a very clear message that they are now the political force. And Afghanistan will now bow to the rule of the Taliban. If you're wondering if the Taliban came into power sort of against the will of the people, that image here of a 1996 Taliban rally gives you some indication. They were very popular. And if you look back through history, when countries fall into disarray, whether it be Napoleon during the French Revolution or whether it be the Taliban, I'm not equating the two, but what I'm saying is that when a country falls into disarray, what they look for is a strong man. They look for a government that is promising peace, order, and stability. That's what the Taliban wanted. Or at least that's what they wanted for the people of Afghanistan. That's the line that they were telling them. We've existed in chaos. We've existed in violence. We will bring stability to this country. So the Taliban was actually embraced by most Afghanis at this time. Quickly, we see that what the Taliban believes was an incredibly strict, incredibly limiting, and incredibly repressive form of Islamic law. Now, very often people will talk about Sharia law. There's a very important distinction to be made. The term Sharia actually translates to a clear path to water. It is a method of living for Muslims. Sharia law is man-made. Sharia law is interpreted by different groups. So what the Taliban did is they took that concept of Sharia, they adjusted it into their version of Sharia law. And that's why you have images like the burqa here. Now that is from the mid 1990s. The picture that you see on my right, probably your left, is from 2021. Any kind of hair salon, beauty salon, any of that type of business were banned by the Taliban. They were vandalized. Women were no longer allowed to work there, and women were actually being driven out of all types of jobs, ranging from education to broadcasting. Which brings us to a point that was the grave concern of people, starting with the rise of the Taliban again in 2021. What will happen to the women and the girls of Afghanistan? Prior to the rise of the Taliban, education for most girls in Afghanistan was still incredibly difficult to get. If you were living in a very poor rural area, some type of extended formal education was just not a reality. However, for those living in cities like Kabul or Kandahar, then education was something that they could achieve. Far more women went to college in Afghanistan than men during those 20 years that we saw the US involved in the country. And you look at a few of these scenes, that one quote from a young Afghan girl who was being denied an education. She told a reporter, "I won't be a doctor, and one day you'll be sick." And as we've referenced in some of our classes, Malala was shot by the Taliban, her best friend killed sitting next to her on her school bus, simply because she expressed interest in being a doctor. And what the Taliban does not have is that long view, that understanding that if you are denying half of your population access to education, access to jobs, access to knowledge, your society will fail. We have seen that proven throughout history. Any culture, any society that educates its women is always more successful. So what the Taliban is doing is it's setting itself up for failure. They don't see it, and it may not happen in nearly a time frame that we would wish, but it is an inevitable collapse. Now that picture on the top side of your screen is actually from a private college in Kandahar, in which women have to be fully covered and segregated from male students. Now, Kabul University, which is the largest college in all of Afghanistan, remains closed. The entire curriculum is being scrubbed by the Taliban to make sure it's appropriate. Women have been told that they cannot return to class. There have been some discussions about perhaps allowing women to return if they're fully covered, but the Taliban has not said definitively that that's the truth. And certainly when we think about education, when we think about freedom of expression, when we think about the capacity to build a life for yourself, those types of rights are basic fundamental human rights that are being absolutely trounced upon by the Taliban as we speak. And it cannot fall on deaf ears around the world because it is happening and it is real. It may not be necessarily leading our news every night any longer, but it is happening. And the Taliban is making it quite clear that it's happening. The Ministry for Women's Affairs, a building that was constructed within the past 20 years, has now been turned into the headquarters of the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. That's the morality police. These are the guys that you sometimes see in clips walking with whips in their hands, hitting anybody who may not be dressed appropriately. They now patrol the streets of large Afghan cities. So the Ministry for Women's Affairs is gone, which symbolically says everything you need to know about the tone of the Taliban government. There are no women in this new government. And when you look at that map, you see the countries that share that distinction. North Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. These are not the countries you want to be associated with in terms of progress. So once again, removing women's voices from government makes that government far too myopic and ultimately self-destructive. So this is a dangerous, dangerous period for Afghanistan. And what you see is that is the structure of the Taliban government as it currently stands. This is their cabinet, if you will. And you can see that they're, obviously it's all men. Most of them we do not have pictures for. A few of these guys we've known about since the 1990s. I will certainly talk about Mr. Haqqani in just a moment. But this is a group of men who have long been associated with the terrorist list in the United States and other Western powers. The Taliban can cry all they like that they're new and they're modern and they're progressive and this is not your father's Taliban and they allow cell phones. It is the exact same group in many cases with the exact same names. And you see the control that they have over Afghanistan. There are some small pockets of rebellions, but they're being unfortunately easily overwhelmed. One of the most pivotal leaders is Abdul Ghani Baradar. Now, Baradar was one of the founders of the Taliban back in 1994. We still don't really know that much about him. Interpol says he was born in either 63 or 68. We really can't get a good sense on his early life, but he was one of the founders of the Taliban with Mullah Muhammad Omar. And Muhammad Omar had an extraordinary influence upon Osama Bin Laden. So this is a man who understands the innermost workings of this group and was there in the early 90s when the Taliban first rose to power. So these are not individuals that we can believe have somehow seen the light, want to change, and want to see Afghanistan move forward in a more progressive direction, which is going to, interestingly, I think, bring Afghanistan into real conflict with a number of their neighbors, not militarily, but looking at it more politically and especially economically. Now, what does Afghanistan mean without the United States? I am not going to, again, delve into the war or the evacuation. But this is now the US Embassy. That is the Taliban flag painted in front of the US Embassy. When America left, we have brought all of our service members home, but what was left behind was a vast collection of military equipment. Now, the US has said that it was absolutely demilitarized. It was absolutely destroyed. Essentially, what you have is just very expensive junk that there's no possible way that any of the helicopters could ever fly, any of the Humvees will ever drive. The Taliban says otherwise. It would be a very safe bet that we would be years away from the Taliban actually being able to convert any of those items into something workable. But to say it could never happen simply is being unrealistic. So that is a component of the US exit that needs to be watched closely, and obviously the US military is. They are keeping a very, very close eye on what the Taliban is doing from a military perspective in terms of the kinds of equipment that they're using. So far, it's been just, so small arms fire, and again, some of those shoulder grenade launchers, nothing of any sort of substance in terms of tanks, helicopters, or Humvees. So what happened to the government? Where did the Afghan government go? And what you have was a government that you saw the absolute lightningly quick departure of its president. Ashraf Ghani, the man who's pictured seated, ran for his life, almost literally, as the Taliban was coming to power. Now, he currently lives in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates granted he and his family what they called humanitarian amnesty. A Russian news outlet reported that Ghani took nearly $170 million with him in duffel bags as he was leaving Afghanistan. One report said there was so much money and so many bags, he couldn't fit all of it in the helicopters, so he had to leave bags of money behind on the tarmac. Replacing him was his longtime vice president, Amrullah Saleh. Now, Saleh still calls himself, by the way, the president of Afghanistan. He has said that the Taliban really doesn't have the control that they claim they do. He's not wrong with that, but he's trying to make it sound as if he is a man still in charge. He's not. Now, the Taliban does not have the control that maybe they say they do, but that is a result of other terror organizations coming in and continue to disrupt Afghan life on a day-to-day basis. So Saleh is talking a big game, and he is a man that needs to be protected. He is a voice of reason in all of this. But to believe that he is in any way making daily decisions and really shaping the Afghan politics is just not true. Instead, we have groups like this. Now, I mentioned this group earlier. They are ISKP, the Islamic State of the Khorasan province, sometimes called ISIS-K. Now, ISIS-K became sort of a buzzword in late August because they were the group that detonated that devastating bomb attack at the Kabul airport. But the way they were covered made it sound as if they were a brand new organization that just suddenly came out of a pod in the midst of the chaos of the American evacuation. That is not true. ISIS-K formed originally in either late 2014 or early 2015. They pledged their allegiance to the Islamic State. Their interpretation of what they call Sharia law is more restrictive than the Taliban. They actually believe the Taliban is not strict enough. And so this is a truly, truly terrifying group. Many of the members are formally were formally involved with the Taliban itself, but went to Pakistan. And within Pakistan, there's a group called the TTP, which is the Pakistani Taliban. And this is actually a breakaway group from that then swore allegiance to the Islamic State. And you see that region of where Khorasan was. Khorasan no longer exists as a formal territory. It's a historical region that those living in parts of Iran and Turkmenistan considered to be a sacred part of their heritage. We've also heard a lot about something called the Haqqani Network. And the Haqqani Network is a vast collection of terror groups. It was first founded in 1970, which is obviously years before people really worked the term terrorism into the lexicon. Now, the group itself today is led by Sirajuddin Haqqani. He happens to be the Minister of the Interior for the Taliban. So for the Taliban to try to pretend that they are somehow disassociated from terror organizations is utterly ridiculous, because they've got the leader of one as their acting Minister of the Interior. The Haqqani Network was part of that larger umbrella of the Mujahideen, the warriors of God who fought against the Soviet Union. You find it operational today, northern Pakistan, near the southeastern tip of Afghanistan. That border, by the way, between Afghanistan and Pakistan is one of the most lawless and dangerous areas in the world. The Haqqani-controlled regions of northern Pakistan have also allowed other groups to settle and train without any fears. So you have Al-Qaeda, the TTP, you have the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. They're all located there, and they're setting up those training camps, which leads to this terrifying future for Afghanistan. In the year 2020, in a group that traces global terrorism, it's an organization called the Institute for Economics and Peace, they list Afghanistan on a scale of 1 to 10 at a 9.59 in terms of being the most affected by terrorism. So what makes that so significant is that was 2020. 2021 has been worse, and it's only getting worse. So that idea of Afghanistan being the most targeted country in the world for terror attacks is very real. And what literally the globe has to do, what the UN, what the EU and other organizations must do, NATO, what they must do is pay attention to which groups are coming in and attempting to dismantle this entire nation, because it's happening. And it's not just happening within Central Asia or the Middle East, you know, the areas that we tend to say, well, that happens over there, that the center of terrorism is in these countries, and we kind of have our list. There are dozens upon dozens of terror organizations right now in Africa. They are growing, they are becoming more intensive, they are pledging loyalty to either IS or Al-Qaeda, and they are looking for an opportunity to also potentially go to Afghanistan. Boko Haram, the group that famously has done mass kidnappings, of schoolgirls in Nigeria. You have the Islamic State of Libya. You have Ansar al-Islam in Egypt. Of course, you have al-Shabaab in Somalia. You have dozens of these groups spreading from Northern Africa all the way down south of the Sahara. And certainly that area through Central Africa of the Sahel has seen an incredibly dangerous rise in terror organizations, really running the gamut from a resurgent Islamic State to Al-Qaeda cells that have been there for years. So the fear is, do these groups begin to see Afghanistan as a safe haven for training and for planning future attacks? And if they do, what does that mean? Do they turn on each other? Do they completely decimate what's left of Afghanistan? What's the world's response? Now, the Taliban has tried, we could say somewhat in vain, they've tried to reach out to other powerful countries. China being the largest and the most significant. China is in the midst right now of what they call their Belt and Road Initiative. It's an infrastructure plan that is going to travel across 65 different countries. It is going to cost, the lowball estimate, $1.2 trillion. They want it done by 2027. So how do you raise $1.2 trillion? Well, you mine it and you economically imperialize it. China has been doing this within Africa for decades. And now they see an opportunity with a wounded Afghanistan. US geologists have estimated that Afghanistan has nearly $1 trillion worth of natural resources buried throughout its mountainside. $1 trillion, which they do not have the capability to successfully access. But of course, who does? China, who has the money, who has the resources, who has the manpower, who has the equipment. So there is a very, very real concern that China can go into Afghanistan, essentially utilize all of these natural resources, acquire close to $1 trillion, and then complete that Belt and Road Initiative, perhaps making China the strongest economy in the world. They're not interested in war. And this is a very important point to remember. China does not want a shooting war with anyone. That's bad for trade. What they want to do is go into Afghanistan, look at those natural resources that Afghanistan has, and take it for themselves. But there's one problem. China right now currently has nearly 2 million Uyghurs, individuals who are a Muslim minority, living in concentration camps, what China calls re-education camps. Now, one might think that that could bring some kind of tension and conflict between Afghanistan, a devoutly Muslim nation, and China. Turns out, no. The Uyghurs are also persecuted in Afghanistan. So that minority that is being beaten, tortured, killed in China, which is, by the way, a genocide that is playing out for the world to watch. These are 2 million people. And the camps are right there for the world to see. In 2015, those camps didn't exist. In 2018, you have the early structure. By 2020, there's nearly 2 million people. But the Uyghurs are also being persecuted by the Taliban. So therefore, yet again, those human rights abuses being carried out by the Chinese government are brushed aside. And so their economic relationship with Afghanistan will go unimpeded because the suffering and the deaths of the Uyghurs simply does not matter. Now, you've had plenty of NGOs, think tanks, advocacy groups absolutely screaming from the rooftops that this is a genocide. And for reasons that I wish I could tell you, but I don't, the world has not responded. And this is not new. This has been going on for years. What about some of the other powers? India, a rising power both globally and within the region, and of course, Russia. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. It's not as clear cut as what it is with China. There's a meeting that was taking place today called the Moscow Format. And it had representatives from India and Russia, as well as a representative of the Taliban. Now, what is interesting is that this Moscow Format idea was introduced as a 6-party coalition between Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, India, and Afghanistan. So as of right now, the Taliban is being treated as a legitimate government because they've been invited to take part in this Moscow Format. One of the reasons why, and this may seem sort of strange to us to hear, but Vladimir Putin is worried. Putin is very, very, very concerned that terrorism growing in Afghanistan would spread and strike his country, as is India. And so this has actually brought Russia and India closer together in terms of working together to defend themselves against terror groups that currently exist in Afghanistan. China is a bit more of an economic wild card. The Chinese have not spoken openly about any sort of fear of terrorism coming from Afghanistan. They're far more concerned about the economic issues. And what they want is to certainly have a stable Afghanistan. They're not necessarily fans of the Taliban one way or another, but if the government is stabilized and the economy is stabilized, then China can go in and reap what they want. Now, coming from the US today was an interesting quote from General Kenneth McKenzie. Now, he's the head of US CENTCOM. He oversees all US troops in the Middle East. The quote he had about the Taliban is that the rise of the Taliban was a, quote, shot in the arm for terrorists and extremists in Afghanistan. So the US actually has been on the periphery of some of these talks. We're not formally engaging, but certainly we are looking at some of our allies and at least saying to them on a global scale, yes, Afghanistan has qualities that are incredibly frightening and that we are going to see this rise in terrorism. which brings us to Pakistan. And Pakistan is even more of sort of a wilder wild card in this. Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said, quote, "This is one of the things we're going to be looking at in the days and weeks ahead, the role that Pakistan played over the past 20 years. Quite frankly, to make it as simple as possible, the United States has never fully trusted Pakistan. Even when the raid that killed Osama Bin Laden took place, the US did not warn the Pakistani government that it was happening for fear that information would be leaked. Now, Pakistan is also under some scrutiny from the United States for perhaps harboring or encouraging the Taliban, or at least not speaking out strongly enough against it. Their current president, Arif Alvi, said he hopes that the Taliban will be inclusive. Their prime minister, Imran Khan, has said the world must engage with the Taliban. Both of those comments have been met with a very, very lukewarm response. The idea that the Taliban is going to be inclusive is nearly impossible. The idea that the world should engage and treat the Taliban as a legitimate government also makes many other countries worried, because this is an organization, and it's true, an organization that has been listed as a terrorist group. Then there's Iran. Now, the Iranians have long been saying that the Taliban is not a friend of theirs. But of course, the enemy is my friend. So when the Taliban was fighting against the United States, Iran openly supported them. With the US now gone and the Taliban coming to power, Iran is far more measured in its words. They did initially release a quote from their leader, Ali Khamenei, that Iran backs efforts to, quote, restore stability in Afghanistan, and as a neighboring and brother nation, invites Afghanistan to reach a national agreement. Now, that's a supportive quote, but it's a very bland quote. There's nothing there that actually pledges Iran's open and tacit support for the Taliban. In fact, if you notice, it doesn't even say the word Taliban. It only speaks about Afghanistan in a general sense. The past 2 weeks have seen two incredibly significant bomb blasts at Shiite mosques in Afghanistan. The first killed nearly 50 people. The second has killed at least 45. Now, it's very important to understand that these mosques were Shia mosques. The Taliban itself is from a branch of Sunni Islam called the Wahhabis, which is the same branch of Islam that governs Saudi Arabia, but they are Sunni. Iran is the largest Shia dominant nation in the world. They're watching Shia brothers get murdered through these bombings. The fear is among Afghan people that the group that is doing this and the group that has taken credit for it is ISIS-K. That the reason why they want to do this is to create a wedge between the Sunni Shia groups within Afghanistan. And so if you divide the country on a sectarian level, then the opportunity to come in and truly occupy it becomes that much more easy. That's the fear. The language coming out of Afghanistan is that they're not going to allow these blasts to split the Sunni Shia Muslims. And Iran is watching this from a distance. And in terms of the Taliban itself, what the Iranian government officially said was that the determination of the Islamic Republic of Iran will be the determination of the Afghanistan people, meaning very simply, if you behave the way we like, maybe we can be friends. If you don't, then Iran can turn against Afghanistan. Understand that Iran sits in a Middle East that is crumbling around her, and Iran certainly believes that she should have the largest hegemony in that region. And not to mention the proxy war that Iran and Saudi Arabia have been fighting in Yemen for 6 years, which again, no one talks about. So there's all of these moving pieces taking place right now in Afghanistan. Can the Taliban maintain control? As terrible as they are, what would ISIS-K look like? Should they take over Afghanistan? What would some of those other terror groups look like if they come in from Africa? We are looking in a very real way at an extraordinarily bloody civil war happening within Afghanistan. Not citizen against citizen, not citizen against government. We could be looking at a civil war of terror group versus terror group, which naturally means who gets caught in the middle? Women, children, and the innocent. This is tragically, perhaps, what lies ahead for Afghanistan. Humanitarian aid is coming in. China has pledged $31 million. Like I've said to the kids in my class, China has $31 million in their pocket right now. $31 million is not a large amount of money. Now, the European Union pledged 1.15 billion. The United States has also been a part of that, saying that we would assist with humanitarian aid. It is food, it is water, it is medical supplies, it's vaccines. All of that is trying to arrive in Afghanistan. But does that humanitarian aid actually get to the people it is supposed to help? Very often when all of this aid arrives, the people who get it are not the people who truly need it. It's on the black market, it's in the hands of the government. And so that starving child somewhere in a remote region of Afghanistan is not going to see US aid, EU aid, or even what China has promised. Which brings us to just about our conclusion tonight. Look at this. The least peaceful country in the world is Afghanistan. Sharing that list with Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, Iraq, Somalia. What do all of these countries have in common? They're failed states. They don't have functioning governments. They don't have trade. They don't have elections. They don't have freedoms of any kind. Their women are not educated. Afghanistan is traveling down a path to be perhaps the world's worst failed state. And that is not for any other reason than the rise of the Taliban. What the Taliban has brought back to Afghanistan, it is back to the future for that country. It is back where it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so that idea that it is the most dangerous country in the world is something that cannot be ignored. Lastly, this term gets thrown around a lot. Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, where empires go to die. It's very hyperbolic. It's very melodramatic. It sounds great because it's romantic. It's not fully true. The British Empire did not collapse in 1921 after the Third Anglo-Afghan War. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had been collapsing for years long before that defeat. Did Afghanistan speed up the process? Certainly, it's a contributing factor. But to believe that communism in the Soviet Union died, and on Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union broke apart solely because of Afghanistan is simply not historically accurate. And people have brought this up because they talk about, well, what does that mean now for the future of the United States? Are we going to be that next tombstone in Afghanistan's graveyard of empires? Well, quite frankly, many of those tombstones don't deserve to be there. Afghanistan is a country that has been conquered, that has been occupied many times. It has been extraordinarily difficult to hold, that is true. But the idea that Afghanistan ended the British Empire, ended the Soviet Union and really set in motion the dismantling of communism around the world is simply not true. America's legacy in Afghanistan is being written as we speak. It is going to be at least, at a minimum, 10 years before we can look back with clearer eyes and see what exactly the lasting results were. It's something that 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, kids will be in history classrooms being taught about this. Afghanistan matters. It matters. It's a country we don't think about unless we were actively engaged in a war there. But it's a country that matters in that region because it is a pivotal piece of a broader geographical and geopolitical puzzle that, as it stands right now, is crumbling before our eyes. The civil war that I consider to be tragically inevitable in Afghanistan is going to arrive sooner than what we might believe. And if the world is not ready to truly help those in need, those who are going to suffer, then we will see that country dissolve into nothing but not a graveyard, but a bright open field of nothing but terrorism. And it's a terrifying future. So it's something that I ask, people always say, well, what can I do? I'm one person. How do I stop a genocide? How do I stop Afghanistan from falling into the hands of ISIS-K? The answer to that is always the same, and that's education. Learn about it. Get interested in it. Make sure that you talk about this and we keep this alive. It's not a pretty topic. It's not a happy topic. It is not something that you're going to want to sit around and talk about with your friends. But the reality is it's happening. And the broader global ramifications of this are remarkably serious, and it could involve us. That's why it matters. So thank you. If you made it all the way this far, you are truly, truly an extraordinary person. I will, if anybody's still awake, I'll happily take any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to share. Before we do that, I just want to again thank everyone involved in the Parents Association for putting this together, and certainly thank all of you. I don't know how many of you are left. I don't have the little number thing. But I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to show up and listen. I truly appreciate it more than you know.